Did the fiery presidential debate between Joe Biden and President Donald Trump inspire or repel voters? The Wall Street Journal's Bill McGurn is here with analysis. And a high-ranking Vatican cardinal resigns amid a financial scandal. The National Catholic Register's Ed PENTIN reports from Rome on the latest. As the pandemic continues, Catholic worship is restricted. But at what cost to the laity and the church? Bishop Thomas PAPROCKI of Springfield, Illinois, updates us on the situation. Finally, what must traditional Christians do to survive in this increasingly secular culture? Columnist and author of the new book, Live Not by Lies, Rod Dreher, will tell us. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. What a lineup we have for you. Bill McGurn, Edward PENTIN, Bishop Thomas PAPROCKI, and Rod Dreher, all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Now, former Vice President Joe Biden and President Donald Trump squared off in one of the most brutal presidential debates in recent history. Did either candidate's performance move undecided voters? Or did the performances of both turn voters off? Joining us with analysis of this first debate of the 2020 presidential race is Wall Street Journal columnist Bill McGurn. Bill, this debate is being widely written off as the worst ever, a train wreck. I was with a focus group and they were mortified by the lack of decorum and the personal attacks. What was your overall impression?
Well, I share the conventional wisdom about this in terms of President Trump. I think that it was a loss for him in the sense I think he was a little overly aggressive. People don't like interruptions, right? It doesn't come across, they can't hear. That said, there's a little of the pearl clutching in this because, you know, debates in the past in our history have been pretty raucous. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, you know, we think of them as this kind of professorial contest, but they used language that we couldn't print in some of these debates. It was very raucous. It was a different format. Each guy spoke for about an hour or so it wasn't the interruption. But it was very raucous. I don't mind raucous. My complaint is when I can't hear what they're saying. I also believe that I would rather have each candidate determine the questions to ask of the other candidate than moderators. I'd like to see them go at it each other more and respond. That tells you a lot. Can they respond on their feet? Can they deal with the pressure? Even when it's unfair, it tells you a lot about the candidates.
No, that 2-minute limitation, Bill, I think undercuts the whole nature of the debate. And frankly, it saves candidates from having to answer in depth, which is a big problem. I want to show this little montage. This is Joe Biden really laying into the president with some salty language.
Mr. President,
You're talking about 2 million people.
You're not President as the moderator.
Folks, do you have any idea what this clown's doing? Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your...
Well, it's hard to get any word in with this clown. You're the worst president America has ever had. Come on.
Biden said Trump was a national embarrassment as a result of this, but he was no better. What impact does this have on voters, do you think, particularly that slim group of undecideds?
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, one of the things that makes me very suspicious is the almost universal agreement on the debate by, you know, the Beltway class, our pundits, people like me, you know, and you. They all seem to be saying the same thing. I'm just not sure the average person sees it the same way. I think they're irritated by the crossover talk on both sides. I think they should let the other guys finish. But on the other hand, I'm not sure the president really hurt himself. I'm not sure he really advanced himself. Joe Biden did prove that he can go the length. A lot of people didn't think, you know, the bar was so low, didn't think he could do that. But look, I mean, the interesting thing now will be, how does each man recalibrate for the next debate? You know, sitting presidents running for re-election do not have good first debates. Jerry Ford botched it when he said Eastern Europe wasn't under Soviet domination. Jimmy Carter did a bad job with Reagan the first time. Reagan did a terrible job with Mondale and recovered in the second debate. George W. Bush had an awful debate with John Kerry, and it kind of made moot his performances in the last two, which were pretty good. And even Barack Obama, I think, lost the first debate. Mitt Romney, although Romney didn't follow up. So there's kind of a tradition of the first debate not being so great for the president.
Yeah. And this one, I thought it was a wash between the two of them. But watching the undecideds, whom I was with in Scranton, I had a focus group, they all thought that Joe Biden had been making this case that he was the empathy candidate. He was the one who cared and would bring decorum and decency back to the White House. He undercut that with that performance, I thought, at the debate. And they saw it. They felt it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they both undercut themselves a little. Again, no one likes interruptions. If you're tuning in, you want to hear what each man says. And so that doesn't serve either of them well. I do think that one of the reasons for the interruptions is they didn't have allowance in the debate format for each man to answer the charges brought up by the other guy. You know, if you just hear something you consider outlandish, you want to, you want to answer it. And I think it was frustrating for both these guys not to be able to answer.
Yeah, no rebuttal time. I want to get into a few key moments. When asked if he was jamming through the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, as the Democrats have accused the president of doing, Trump had this to say.
I will tell you very simply, we won the election. Elections have consequences. We have the Senate, we have the White House, and we have a phenomenal nominee, respected by all.
The left has been attacking Trump for what they call a double standard. When Obama nominated Merrick Garland to the bench and the Senate refused to confirm him, how did Trump's argument hold up, do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think he has a good argument there. I think Mitch McConnell has a good argument. Technically, it's not a violation of what they did because Mitch McConnell made it very clear, unlike some of the other Republicans, that in the Merrick Garland case, he was not holding a vote on it because the Senate and the White House were in the hands of different parties. That is not the case now. I would go further. It's just extraordinary to me at a time when the Democrats are saying, let's abolish the Electoral College, let's get rid of the filibuster, let's stack the Supreme Court. Every time something doesn't go their way, they want to change the whole rules. Nothing the Republicans are doing now violates the Constitution. It's fully in keeping with their constitutional prerogatives.
You brought up what the Democrats are planning in retaliation for a confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. Vice President Biden was asked explicitly about this, either ending the filibuster or packing the court. Here was his response.
Whatever position I take on that, that'll become the issue. The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now. Make sure you, in fact, let people know you're a senator. I'm not going to answer the question.
Frankly, how did he get away without having to answer that question, Bill?
Yeah, it's an outrageous answer. I'm not going to answer the question because my answer might be an issue. Well, that's why we have elections, to let people know where we stand and what they're going to do, not to hide it. Look, I thought the more egregious thing was not, in addition to not pressing him on that and not making him answer, the more egregious thing is, okay, you asked Donald Trump about white supremacy, fair enough. But no one asked Joe Biden about the treatment of Amy Coney Barrett, fellow Catholic. You know, at his convention, it was all about how the Democratic Party is today faith-friendly. There's not a single story on Joe Biden that doesn't mention the rosary beads he carries in his pocket and that he goes to church regularly. I think he ought to have been asked, does he repudiate the attacks on her faith made by a lot of his fellow Democrats and say there's no home for this in his Democratic Party? He wasn't even asked, which I think is a terrible thing, too.
No, you wrote an excellent piece on just this question recently, and it's worth reading. The economy and shutdown due to COVID-19 are very much on people's minds, Bill. When asked about the difference between his recovery plan and Biden's, the president said this.
He will shut it down again. He will destroy this country. You know, a lot of people, between drugs and alcohol and depression, when you start shutting it down, you take a look at what's happening in some of your Democrat-run states where they have these tough shutdowns. And I'm telling you, it's because they don't want to open it. One of them came out last week. You saw that. Oh, we're going to open up on November 9th. Why November 9th? Because it's after the election. They think they're hurting us by keeping them closed. They're hurting people.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan has decided to extend the shutdown through October. Now, Bill, the unemployment rate since the beginning of this virus has gone above 14%. At last reporting in August, it was at 8.4%, which is still high. Do you think Trump's answer resonated with voters?
I think it does with some. The problem is we live in a very bifurcated country right now. You know, we all hear all the time this platitude, we're all in it together. In my town in suburban New Jersey, we're not in it all together. I can sit and do my job here from my office. It's at most an inconvenience for me, but I know people who are really struggling because they own retail shops and so forth. Right. They can't open. Restaurants are at a very limited capacity. So God bless these people, because I don't know how they make it through. They're being stuck, you know, hairstylists and so forth. They don't have the glam jobs, but they're really being stuck. And our governor is one of those governors keeping very, very heavy restrictions on. So I think the president is right about that. And also it's right to put this forward as a difference between the two men. Joe Biden was asked, would he shut it all down if someone, say at the CDC, told him to? And he said yes. And it kind of ignores that there are risks to opening, but there are also risks to being shut down. Not just economic risks, there are a lot of health-associated risks too, which the CDC talks about.
Yeah, and risks to our constitutional rights, as we'll discuss later with Bishop PAPROCKI. Race came up at this first debate. Trump was asked if he would condemn white supremacy, as you mentioned earlier. Here was his response.
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing.
And then Biden responded this way about Antifa.
This is a left-wing.
FBI director.
This is a left-wing problem.
White supremacists. Antifa's an idea, not an organization.
What do you make of that, Bill? I call them vow moments, where, you know, you try to get a candidate to make a vow. He'll accept this or condemn that. Right. But there were no such vows presented to Biden, even on this Antifa point.
Exactly. Look, I think it was really outrageous that the moderator brought up Charlottesville, which we know is a fraud. The idea that Trump was saying some neo-Nazis are very fine people and white supremacists. No one really believes that Donald Trump is a racist. Now, that said, as in so many other things, whether it's because he just doesn't want to give in to the crowd trying to pin him down or catch him in a gotcha, I think Donald Trump could have given an answer that was a little more clear. Said, yes, of course I condemn white supremacists. I don't want them in the party, and I condemn their actions. And he could have gone to say, but in our cities now, we really should be condemning Antifa and the other people causing all this problem to people's lives and livelihoods on our street. I think he could have given a better answer. It's the same with his answer on whether he'll respect the election results. Obviously, he doesn't want to speculate about losing, but I think he should have said, of course, I will respect fair and clear results. And
I also think
so
it's very hard.
He's an unconventional man. He's a package deal.
Yep.
The things that makes him a fighter sometimes also makes him kind of stumble on these questions.
I also think, as you pointed out, it's very difficult when you've got 2-on-1. You know, two people haranguing you to do something, and you feel you're having to fight them both off at once. I think that was part of the confusion in the way the answer was offered, and in the style in which it was offered, which was know, pugnacious and tough. The president had this to say about law and order. Listen, Bill.
We believe in law and order, but you don't. The top 10 cities and just about the top 40 cities are run by Democrats and in many cases radical left, and they've got you wrapped around their finger, Joe. He has no law enforcement
That's not
support,
true.
almost
That's
nothing.
Look.
Oh, really? Who do you have? Name one group that supports you. Name one group that came out and supported you. Go ahead. Think. We have time.
We don't have time to do anything.
Yeah, there was a lot of, oh, the clock is up, I can't answer. But this is a key point, I mean, that the president is raising about defunding the police, which Biden says he opposes, but he does support reimagining the police and perhaps allocating some of those funds to other places. Your thoughts on this? Does this play?
Yeah.
We see a lot of police unions supporting Trump.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, another case where Joe Biden says he's against riots and violence. They should be punished. But he won't get specific. Like, you know, they're asking Donald Trump about Proud Boys, but they don't ask Mr. Biden about what he would do. And does he think the Democratic mayors and governors should call out the National Guard and put these things down? Does he think that people should be let out on the streets by Democratic district attorneys after they're elected? This was one of the breakthrough moments for President Trump. And it's also one of the reasons I think it's kind of cheap to say, oh, it was a wasted night and no one learned anything. If you're paying attention on both sides, you learned some differences about each man, what he would do in respect to different cases. So I think there were moments where clarity came through that President Trump stands for one thing and former Vice President Joe Biden stands for another.
The Commission on Presidential Debates, Bill, as a result of what happened, they are suggesting perhaps changes for the next debate. Now, they haven't exactly said what those would be. Some suggest the moderator should be able to shut off the candidate's mic if they continue to talk beyond their allotted time. Is that a good idea?
I don't think so.
I don't either.
I want to see debates more in control by the candidates and less filtered through moderators. Look, if you interrupt and you shout and you talk over someone else, the voters will see that and it will hurt you. I'm very suspicious about letting moderators determine the debate and define all the questions. I'd rather see, frankly, each guy just up there and they each go at each other. Again, my caveat is you have to be able to hear what they say. But again, if someone violates this, they'll be punished by the voters. And that's really who should make the decision.
Yeah, it should be the candidates. And you know, they each asked more interesting questions at moments than, frankly, were being discussed at the time. Let the other candidates spar with them and come up with an answer for the people.
And Raymond, you know, the reason for that is presumably each man has his idea of what's most important and what the weaknesses of his opponent are. So he will ask tougher questions than any moderator could, it seems to me. And I think that's an education for the American voter.
You're right. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in Rome this week. I want your opinion of this. He urged the church to stand up for human and religious rights, particularly vis-a-vis China. I know this is something you've been reporting on for years. Watch.
Pope Francis has exhorted the church to be permanently in a state of mission. It's a hope that resonates with this evangelical Protestant who believes, as the Holy Father does, that those of us given the gift of Christian faith have an obligation to do our best to bless others. To be a church permanently in a state of mission has many meanings. Surely one of them is to be a church permanently in defense of basic human rights, a church permanently opposed to tyrannical regimes, a church permanently engaged in support of those who wish to take the risk of freedom of which Pope John Paul II spoke, especially, most especially, where religious freedom is denied or limited or even crushed.
Bill, what do you make of this and the resistance that Pompeo has received from those in the Roman Curia?
Well, the Wall Street Journal, we have an editorial today on Mr. Pompeo's speech. I thought it was superb. He has written, as you know, before this speech, he wrote an article for First Things talking about China and all the violations that have occurred since the Vatican reached its deal, which is still secret. We don't know the terms. So it hasn't brought about good behavior. And I think he's absolutely right. I do think the Vatican's treatment of him was not proper. I mean, they say they denied, they yanked a meeting that he was going to have with the Holy Father. And they say it's because it's too close to the election. Well, Cardinal Zen flew all the way from Hong Kong. Cardinal Zen knows more than anyone in Rome what it's like to deal with the Chinese Communist Party. And they didn't give him an audience. Was that because of an election? Is the Cardinal up for election somewhere, or his party? I think they would do well to heed the Secretary's advice. Also, in his remarks, after the speech, he had a press availability. And one of the reporters said, you know, people in the Vatican feel that you're attacking them on this. And he said, oh, quite to the contrary. He wrote his article to honor the Catholic Church, to honor its witnesses, to point out what it's done, not to underestimate the soft power it has by going at totalitarians and authoritarians at their weakest spot, their moral credibility. So I thought it was a tremendous witness by Secretary Pompeo, and I think he and Cardinal Zen were treated rather shabbily.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see, it's a shame that politics gets wrapped in here, or politics or ideology is used to somehow dismiss what are very important issues, and the human suffering occurring to the Chinese people, to the Chinese faithful, is abominable. And Cardinal Zen, he doesn't have a political axe to grind. He's screaming out for his people. Bill, just before we end, how does this all relate, this Vatican-China deal, how does it relate to what we're seeing in Hong Kong? You all mentioned that in your editorial today at the Wall Street Journal.
Well, I think there's several ways. Look, Hong Kong used to be separate from China, and the Chinese, with their mainland Chinese communists, with their new national security law, has changed that. Now Hong Kong's just as bad in terms of human rights as China. The two most prominent Catholic laymen in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai, newspaper owner, and Martin Lee, the founder of the Democratic Party, have both been arrested. So you can see the threat. It's not just in like the backwoods of China in some rural Catholic church. It's right in Hong Kong, the most international city of China. And though the terms of the deal the Vatican reached remain secret, we can see the results in the increased persecution, not just of Catholics, but of Buddhists, of Muslim Uyghurs, of Protestant house churches. That's all increased. And as it's increased, the other consequence that we see is the Vatican's silence. The Vatican just won't criticize China, the most egregious violator of religious liberty on the earth today.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's an important point. Bill McGurn, we could talk all night. You can keep up with Bill McGurn's commentary at the Wall Street Journal, WSJ.com. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Raymond.
Joining me now is the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register and author of the book, The Next Pope, The Leading Cardinal Candidates. Please welcome back to the program, Edward PENTIN, who joins us from Rome. Ed, what do we know of these allegations against Beishu and 6 other people who are to stand trial?
Well, the Vatican hasn't actually released any information about the allegations, but we're led to believe that it's largely to do with the London deal, the now infamous London deal that went sour, which accrued a large amount of losses for the Vatican. There's also money connected with money that he gave to Caritas in Sardinia related to his brother. There's another aspect to this regarding going back a bit. He wanted to invest hundreds of millions of euros from the Secretary of State into some Angolan project. Cardinal Becciu was a previous nuncio there. But the key one is this London property deal, which I think is really at the heart of this, although nothing, as I say, has been officially announced yet about the charges against him.
What would this trial mean for Becciu now that he's no longer a cardinal? What does that open him up to as far as prosecution is concerned?
Well, it opens him up to both a Vatican trial and possibly a civil trial too. It really opens him up for prosecution in both ways. If he was still a cardinal and he had all the rights of a cardinal, I mean, he is still technically a cardinal, but if he had all the rights, only a pope can judge a cardinal. But by removing those rights, it means he's open to prosecution from civil authorities as well as the Vatican and canonical ones as well.
A joint investigation between Italy and the Vatican provided evidence that Becciu directed Vatican and Italian church funds to that charity controlled by his brother, which you mentioned. What do we know about that group? And was money actually transferred?
Well, we don't know much at all, really, but that's another shady deal. What we do know more about is this London property deal, and I've been looking into it more past week or so, and that is a deal that he oversaw, and it led to what I was told by somebody who studied it in great detail for the last couple of years, to mind-blowing losses for the Vatican, going into possibly, potentially hundreds of millions of euros. Now, in order to try to stave off those losses, they ended up actually making things worse by bringing in another broker who charged them a fortune as well, and also sort of made the situation worse and ended up with even more losses. So it became an enormous scandal, an enormous problem, and Cardinal Becciu was overseeing almost all of that. Wow. Up until his promotion out in 2018. Sorry.
Just so our viewers understand, the Vatican paid 350 million euros for that London property. It was worth about 180 million. And some of the money was borrowed, so the losses might be even greater, as Ed was just talking about. Ed, what else do we know about this? The overpaying? Now, the Vatican, I mean, they released their budget for the first time, the complete budget. And I read an interview with a financial officer at the Vatican that said losses are part of the process, that profits are not part of our mission. What do you make of that? And does that encourage people to give to St. Peter's Pence this weekend?
Yes, I mean, I saw that too. It's a rather strange thing to say because, of course, we were sort of taught to believe not to go into debt. They're saying that it's okay to go into some debt as long as it's not as long as it's manageable. But yes, this has been a concern quite a bit lately because before, I think 2018, the Holy See was, or the Curia rather, was 70 million euros in debt. They managed to get that down to 11 million, and now, of course, with the coronavirus, it's going to be much higher. But there are wider concerns about Peter's Pence, as you alluded to, and that's something I'm looking into now. There does seem to be problems there, although the head of the Secretariat, who you quoted earlier, said that the Peter's Pence was not actually used to fund these property deals in London. It does seem as though some of the money did go to these deals, not to cover it, but to contribute to it. And I think to contribute to paying off some of the loans that they took out to buy these properties. And that, unbelievable. That is, I believe, they've tried to liquidate some of the assets of Peter's Pence in order to pay for that. But as I say, I'm looking into this, and I hope to get some confirmation next week.
That's amazing. Cardinal George Pell, the former Vatican treasurer, arrived back in Rome this week. It's been reported that his return to Rome is unrelated to the current financial scandal at the Vatican. Now, you've reported that Cardinal Pell is expected to stay in Rome for some months and possibly be called upon unofficially to help with some aspects of financial reform. What might Pell be asked to do, Ed?
Well, I think there's possibilities that he's going to be a sort of unofficial consultant to the Pope and to the Vatican, those involved in Vatican finances. I don't know if it's going to be sort of a long-term thing, but I'm told that it could be 6 months or more that he'll be here, and that the Pope wants to give him, quote, bits and pieces to do while he's here. And that could involve, as I say, something to do with finance, but also he's still a member of certain dicasteries, including, I think, the Congregation for Bishops. So he may return to doing some work with them as well. And I think he's staying back in where he was living before. And so I think much is continuing as it was before he left, of course, without the job of being prefect to the Secretariat for the Economy.
Well, it's certainly a vindication for Cardinal Pell after all he's been through in Australia and finally vindicated by the courts. But now, returning to Rome, I'm sure, is a personal vindication for him and an important sign for his confreres and for the world to see. Now, the day before the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See's symposium on advancing and defending international religious freedom through diplomacy, that was the name of the conference, the Vatican defended its deal with China, Ed. Vatican editorial director Andrea Tornielli wrote, The provisional agreement exclusively treats the process for the appointment of bishops an essential question for the life of the Church and for the necessary communion between the pastors of the Chinese Catholic Church with the Bishop of Rome and with the bishops throughout the world. The goal of the provisional agreement, therefore, has never been merely diplomatic, much less political, but was always genuinely pastoral. Its objective is to permit the Catholic faithful to have bishops in full communion with the successor of Rome or successor of Peter, who are at the same time recognized by the authorities of the People's Republic of China. Ed, your thoughts on that justification for this deal, saying, well, this is just pastoral, just so everybody can be in the same club.
Yes, that is certainly how the Vatican seems to see it. They see it as primarily, ultimately, to improve evangelization in China. But as Cardinal Parolin has said yesterday, and he said many times, this is a step-by-step process. It's going to take a long time, and patience is needed. But yes, this is how they see it. And I think part of the big problem here is because a lot of dioceses, a lot of parishes are without priests and bishops, and so they feel there's a great need to fill those urgently with bishops and priests who are faithful to Rome, who are in communion rather with Rome. So that's the underlying purpose of this agreement.
But there's the problem, Ed. I mean, you mentioned it. They'd like to see bishops faithful to Rome. The fact is, as Cardinal Zen has said repeatedly, as people in China that I've spoken to, priests and dissidents have said, the Vatican is allowing China to choose these bishops. They may not be faithful to Rome. Certainly this newfangled gospel with Xi and Mao sprinkled in the midst of the scripture, that's not being faithful to anything, much less God. So I want to move on to this and reflect on all of that. During the symposium that we talked about earlier, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo urged the Vatican to join the U.S. in denouncing China for violations of religious freedom. Listen.
Nowhere, however, is religious freedom under assault more than it is inside of China today. That's because, as with all communist regimes, the Chinese Communist Party deems itself the ultimate moral authority. An increasingly repressive CCP, frightened by its own lack of democratic legitimacy, works day and night to snuff out the lamp of freedom, especially religious freedom, on a horrifying scale.
What has been the reaction in Rome to Secretary Pompeo's opinion of this Vatican-China deal and his advocacy here?
Well, I think they obviously agree that he's quite right to hold those views if those are the views of the Trump administration. What they are concerned about, what they didn't like, was that he wrote this op-ed in First Things, which directly criticized the Vatican, or rather warned them not to renew this provisional agreement. And they felt that was an unnecessary and unwelcome interference in Vatican affairs, and something that's not done normally in diplomatic circles, and especially before a high-level meeting as happened today between Mike Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo, and Cardinal Parolin and Archbishop Gallagher. So this is the concern, that there's a certain perhaps crossing of boundaries, which is normally something that they don't do, especially before a meeting, as I say tonight.
Yeah, I have to tell you, for someone who's been covering this for 25 years, to watch what's happened in China and what this deal hath wrought in the lives of Chinese clergy and the underground church, who are the loyal followers of Rome. It's a heartbreaker. And then you've got the Uyghur Muslims put in these internment camps, the routine expelling and arrests of bishops and priests. I just don't see how this makes pastoral or political sense, it seems to me. But I'm opining here. Forgive me. At the same event, Holy See Secretary for Relations with States, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, who you mentioned a moment ago, he said this. Listen.
It should come as no surprise that the protection and promotion of religious liberty is one of the main political priorities of the Holy See. In its bilateral relations, the question of protecting religious freedom so as to allow the local Catholic Church to exercise its mission remains an indispensable part of the scope and activity of the Holy See.
As we mentioned earlier, Ed, the situation over the past 2 years has gotten worse for the Catholic Church in China. What is the Vatican hoping to gain through this deal? And what do you make of the Pope's refusal to meet both with Mike Pompeo, which I understand, he's worried about the politics there in an election year, but also refusing to meet with Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong?
Yes, but as I was saying earlier, I mean, this is the way they see this agreement. They see it as very much a long-term thing, and that ultimately it will all work to the good. But of course, this is very much the sort of Vatican Ostpolitik that was tried back in the 60s and 70s, which was seen to fail, and of course, which John Paul II and Benedict criticized, because they said you can't compromise with a communist regime like there is in China, for example. And this is what the Vatican seems to be doing. But the issue of the Pope not seeing Secretary Pompeo, I think, is quite significant in the sense that it shows just how sensitive the Vatican is to criticism of this agreement and criticism of its position. I think it was quite strongly related with the sort of the run-up to this meeting. As I say, I think they didn't like this article that was written beforehand, and I think they felt it wasn't just about meddling in the election. It was put to Archbishop Gallagher exploiting the Vatican for electoral purposes. I think it was probably more to do with this sensitivity over this agreement. That seems to be quite clear, at least from what the people I've spoken to here, that it's that they really don't want, as I said earlier, any kind of interference in this. They want to let it go and just take the long-term view and see how it works out. But I think a lot of people here too, I don't know if there's a lot, but I think some were grateful about how straightforward and frank Secretary Pompeo was about this, and the need to speak up in the face of these injustices, not just for Catholics there, but also all religions, and particularly the Uyghurs, who are, of course, being seriously subjected to human rights violations in a part of China.
Well, I also think the refusal to meet with Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong is a critical mistake here. And I understand, I think it's part of the same thinking, that to do so would telegraph to the world that we are somehow listening to those who criticize or are watchful of what China is doing to the people in mainland China. But I have to tell you on a personal note, Ed, I've been subjected to a lot of this for daring. Again, I've been reporting this for 25 years. I haven't changed. People's view of human rights and religious abuses have changed. In John Paul II's reign, in Benedict's reign, this was an outrage and a deal breaker. You just didn't deal with these regimes. Now we have a different thinking, but don't kill the messenger here, who are reporting on the abuses and the deaths, the heinous, grievous sins enacted against faithful people for doing nothing but enacting their faith. And that's what we're trying to report on here and will continue to do. Ed Pentin, thank you for being here. The book, The Next Pope, The Leading Cardinal Candidates by Edward Pentin, is available at bookstores everywhere, online, and at EWTN's religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. And you can follow Ed on Twitter at Edward Pentin. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Raymond.
Here with an update on the restrictions that continue to be placed on Catholic worship during this pandemic and the negative effects he's seeing on the laity and the church in his diocese is Bishop Thomas PAPROCKI of Springfield, Illinois. Bishop, thank you for being here. I want to begin with a recent essay you've written. It's called Social Shutdowns as an Extraordinary Means of Saving Human Lives. It was published in Ethics and Medics. In it, you write, the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of preserving life is important, for if a means is extraordinary, that is, if the burdens outweigh the benefits, then it is not morally obligatory and should not be coerced by state power. In the face of a pandemic, we do have a moral obligation to shut down our society, require people to stay at home, put employees out of work, send businesses into bankruptcy, impair the food supply chain, and prevent worshipers from going to church? I would say no. Why do you say no, and what negative effects do you see stemming from these shutdowns?
Well, as I was reflecting on what we did over the last 6 months or so, it just occurred to me that this was really extraordinary. You know, we shut everything down, told people to stay home, don't go to work, don't go to school. We even closed our churches and don't go to mass, don't receive communion. And the word extraordinary just kept coming back to me. And then I recall that word from my studies in medical ethics. And Catholic medical ethics makes this distinction between ordinary and extraordinary, going back to Pope Pius XII, when he talked to Catholic physicians and anesthesiologists in 1957. And he made that distinction. It said, we have to use ordinary means, but we don't have to use extraordinary means. And I think many of us have faced that with people in their elderly years, who they're dying and or terminally ill, and we're wondering, do we have to give them every possible treatment and give them a feeding tube and hook them up to all kinds of machines and IVs? And we say, no, that's extraordinary. So my thought was, well, if that applies to individuals, what about society as a whole? And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, you know what, we don't always take extraordinary means. And I used the example in my essay about traffic fatalities. We've had over 35,000 people die every year since 1951 in traffic accidents. And if we were concerned about, we have to do everything to prevent anyone from dying, well, then we should shut our highways. We should not get in our cars. But we don't do that. We have to get to work. We have to get to school. Our lives have to go on. So we take ordinary precautions. We use seatbelts and airbags and follow the rules of the road. So I think the reason I wrote this was to try to add something to the conversation, and anticipating that if there's another wave of the COVID or another very serious flu, that what are we going to do? And I would hope that in the future we could take the more ordinary means that we've been using, like safe distancing and good hygiene, cleaning surfaces, wash your hands, and not take the extraordinary means of shutting everything down again.
Illinois is still in phase 4. Governor Pritzker's COVID-19 mitigation plan, which he unilaterally implemented in May, it's had some heavy side effects. Have you reached out to Governor Pritzker to discuss opening up the Mass to more people?
Well, yes, our bishops' conference, the Catholic Conference of Illinois, we have been in touch with the governor's office, and we did get an accommodation through the Illinois Department of Public Health that provided for guidance, allowing for 25% in our churches. So we have gotten some opening in that regard. But as to where we're going to go and when we'll be able to open up further, right now, that's still an open question.
You write in your essay that we've heard very few warnings about moral hazards that can kill the soul, and that some, for example, have said access to liquor or casinos or abortion are essential, but going to church and access to the sacraments are not. Why aren't we seeing more of a pushback from Catholic bishops and other religious when it comes to this unequal treatment of places of worship as compared to other public utilities and businesses?
Well, I think when this all started back in March, we, the bishops and other leaders in the church, were thinking, we want to be good citizens. We didn't know, nobody knew at the time how serious this was going to be and what steps or how long. Looking back at some of our emails and communications in March, we thought we would close our schools for about 2 weeks, and then we would be able to reopen. And then that extended another month, and it just kept going and going. And right now, there's no end in sight to this. So I think as we looked at that, and then also saw situations where Nevada, for example, people can go to the casinos. And in most places, you can go to these big supermarkets, and with no limits on the number of people there, apparently, but with very severe limits on people coming to churches. So I think that the response at the beginning was very cautious, but I think as this goes on, I hope that we'll speak out more. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this piece, so that hopefully add to the moral vocabulary. I hear a lot of people, talking about this and sort of the generic terms or anecdotal terms about why we need to get back to school, and our Catholic schools are reopening again. And when I hear from teachers and parents and even students, it's unusual to hear students saying they're happy to be back in school, but we're doing that, and we can do that. So I think as we look to the future, when we have to have these conversations, and again, I would say, yes, we should do what we can, but we have to really look at what do we have to do, what should we do, and what are things that we can do voluntarily that are not morally required for us to do.
No, this is an important theological, moral component that you've injected into this debate, because too often, as you said, we see the slogans, do the right thing, do the moral thing, stay home. Well, that may not be the moral or right thing for a whole group of people, and certainly for society as a whole. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Archbishop Cordileone in San Francisco led a procession following the Eucharist, or carrying the Eucharist, through the streets of his city. They passed City Hall under the banner, "We are essential, free the Mass." Now, this week, Mayor London has finally agreed to allow indoor masses of up to 50 people. Have you considered, or the bishops of Illinois, holding a similar type of procession to open up the Mass to the people and give your people access to these sacraments that are essential?
Yes, we have considered that. I would say that from what I hear and see, that the restrictions have been a lot more severe in California. So I commend Archbishop Cordileone for doing that in San Francisco. Right now, we're at 25% in Illinois, and we still have the dispensation in place for people not to go to masses. So right now, we're not being strained with that. So I would say that we do have to look at the moral issues that are involved here. We also have to listen when people say follow the science. Which science do you follow? Because if you talk to an epidemiologist, rightly, they're going to say what you should do to avoid contagious disease. But there are other sciences. If you talk to pediatricians or child psychologists, they'll tell you, for example, children need to be in school. And so we follow that science in terms of why we've reopened our schools. So it's a very complicated situation, and there's a lot of nuances to this. So I think that it's just important for us not to respond with slogans and think that that's going to answer all the questions.
I love that. It's a good place to end, and I love the balance you're inserting into this conversation. Bishop Thomas PAPROCKI, thank you for your time. Where can people find your essay?
They can find my essay. It's on our website for the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois. It's just dio.org.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
As a backdrop to everything we've been discussing tonight is a cultural decline. How can people of faith move forward? In a new book, my next guest suggests that we may be heading down a dangerous path toward totalitarianism. He's the senior editor at the American Conservative and author of the new book, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. Please welcome back to the program, Rod DREHER. Rod, why did you write this book now, and after the events of the last 4 years, did you realize how prescient it would be?
No, I had no idea how prescient it would be, Raymond. I got a call 5 years ago from a Catholic doctor in Minnesota who said, look, I have to tell somebody this. My mother is elderly, lives with me and my wife. She spent 6 years in a communist prison in her home country of Czechoslovakia for her Catholic faith. And now she says that the same things that she got away from in Czechoslovakia seem to be occurring right here in America. I thought that was really alarmist. So then I started talking to other people here in America, immigrants who had come from communist countries, and every one of them, Raymond, say the same thing. It's happening here, and they're upset that Americans can't see it. I thought when I wrote this book finally earlier this year that I would have a tough time trying to sell it to people, trying to convince my fellow Americans and fellow Christians that we were facing a situation as dire as this. But after the events of the last 5 months, I have no trouble being able to convince people that we really are in a very, very bad situation.
Rod, explain the significance of the title, Live Not by Lies. Aside from the obvious moral implication, it's a quote.
Yeah, it is a quote. The great Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, on the eve of being expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974, he sent out an essay to all of his followers with the title, Live Not by Lies. What he meant by that was saying to his people that, listen, we don't have any power here in this totalitarian government, but the one thing we can do is stand up for the truth and never, ever, ever consent to lies. I think that's good advice for us, too, in this growing soft totalitarianism we see here.
Well, it's harder and harder to do it, Rod, and part of that is there are people policing the borders, ideological borders that they've created, that the truth is not welcome in many places. Look, I could show you, if we had a few hours, the scars from reporting both inside and outside the church. They will attack you ruthlessly for daring to just say, wait a minute, let's look at this. Maybe there's another thing happening here that we're missing. Now, in researching the book, you interviewed many people, men and women who lived under communism in various forms. So many people thought with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was the end of it. There was no need to fear communism any longer. What did these people tell you of their experience, and what are they most concerned about looking at the U.S. today?
Yeah, it's not that they fear the return of communism per se. They don't think that's coming back, and I don't think that's coming either. But it's rather a different form of totalitarianism. It doesn't have to be the sort of George Orwell Stalinist form involving secret police and gulags. Rather, this is going to be more of a soft totalitarianism like from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. To be specific, it's going to be a case of major corporations, institutions, and perhaps even the government manipulating people by controlling access to jobs, to the economy, and to privileges. And this is the sort of thing that these dissidents are trying to tell us. It's happening in America, and just because it doesn't involve jackboots doesn't mean it's not totalitarianism.
Well, look, I took a trip recently. I won't say to what state, but I landed in the state. For the next 4 days, I got called by contact tracers wanting to know, where are you now? Who have you been with? Have you been tested? Can you give us a rundown of where you are in our state? Where are you staying? I've never seen anything like this. What do you see as the most glaring similarities between totalitarianism in the last century and what we're seeing in the political realm today?
Right. Well, there's a difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Authoritarianism is when all the political power is concentrated in one leader or one party, but they don't care about the rest of society. Totalitarianism is an extreme form of authoritarianism in which they want to control your mind and your soul, too. You have to learn to love Big Brother. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing now. The cancel culture from the progressives has ramped up so much that you can't even be silent anymore. Your silence is taken as a sign of your own guilt. That's the thing that we have to worry about. Just today, I posted on my blog something about transgenderism and youth. There are people out there, activists, parents who are desperate to get people to listen to them, and the media to listen about the way transgenderism is exploiting our youth and how schools are even collaborating to deceive parents. Nobody will talk about it because you'll lose your job, you'll lose your livelihood. This sort of thing is happening right now in the land of the free.
Now, critics of your point of view would dismiss your premise as alarmist, Rod. That they say, look, that's not going to happen here in the U.S. This is still a beacon of freedom and democracy around the world. After all, the government isn't rolling tanks into the streets. There's no declaration of martial law. Is it the government that we have to worry about in this scenario? Or is it something else? Is it Is it pop culture? Is it the universities? What are you talking about here?
Yeah, it's primarily big business. And this is one thing that makes it so hard for American conservatives to understand, so-called woke capitalism. You might remember, Raymond, about 5 years ago when the state of Indiana passed its religious freedom restoration law. It was an ordinary thing, just a state version of the federal law. But big business came down like a ton of bricks on the state, and the state backed down. I think we're going to be seeing that sort of thing more and more happen in this country. And as long as we are just looking to the government as the sole source of totalitarianism, we're going to miss what's happening. What's also happening is these major corporations are taking in so much data from us, as you were mentioning earlier, from our smartphones, from our computers, and they're storing this data. It will be used against us, just like the Chinese are doing now with their social credit system. We're going to have an American social credit system.
Is any of this reversible at this point? Or are we rushing headlong into this soft totalitarianism, this wokeness that you talk about, and we just have to deal with it?
Well, no, I hope it's reversible, and I think that we should not surrender to it. Yeah, well, you know, we have to vote for good political leaders who are courageous enough to stand up against it and to get good judges on the court. That's one reason I'm very happy with Amy Coney Barrett. On the other hand, Raymond, we really cannot allow ourselves to think that just voting for the right people or getting the right judges is going to be enough. This totalitarianism is succeeding by taking over the culture, especially elite culture. One thing I learned from talking to these people in the communist countries is it always starts with the elites, but it spreads out from there. This is happening. The sort of things that we were seeing 10, 15 years ago only at universities is now moving out into corporate boardrooms and to high schools, elementary schools. It's really alarming.
Do younger people especially lack the knowledge of history, what you call the cultural memory, to really combat this? How critical is that cultural memory to avoid the mistakes of the past?
It's absolutely critical, and you're right. We just haven't taught history to our young people. The whole communist
era. Well, we taught them history. It's a twisted, I would argue, ideologically informed history, and that's the problem.
Sure, and the whole communist era has been memory holed by Hollywood. I mean, my kids know more about the Nazi era than the communist era just from watching TV and popular culture. We have got to do better about that because controlling cultural memory is key to controlling a people. In my book, I talk about young Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła. When he was in Nazi-occupied Poland, he knew that the Nazis were going to try to control the Poles by destroying their memory of themselves as a nation and destroying their Catholic faith. So he couldn't take up weapons against them. The Nazis were too powerful. So what Wojtyła and his friends did were write plays about Polish patriotic history and also about their Catholic faith to keep that cultural memory alive. They performed these plays in the face of the Gestapo. If the Gestapo had burst in to catch them, they would have executed them, but they did it. We have to do things just like that.
You're an Orthodox Christian, Rod. You've always written extensively about faith. You end the book with a chapter on suffering. You call it a gift, and learning to endure suffering well, being so important during these times. Why?
Boy, that is one of the most profound lessons of this whole project for me, Raymond, was talking to people, mostly Catholics and Orthodox, but also a Russian Baptist, who said that if Christians are not able to suffer for the truth and for our Lord, they're not going to make it through this persecution. If we're not willing to suffer the scorn of our neighbors, a loss of job, a loss of our individual liberty, and maybe even the loss of life, we're not going to have what it takes to make it through what's coming. This is the testimony of the church since the foundation of the church. Our church was a church of martyrs. And now we are going to see that being martyrs being made again and again. I don't want to be pessimistic, Raymond. I'm not optimistic about the future, but I am hopeful because as Christians, we know that Christian hope doesn't mean that everything's going to work out great in the end, but it means that if we suffer and unite our sufferings to Christ, the Lord will use that for redemption. That's the kind of hope that these people in the communist countries can offer us, and that's, I think, the only hope we have.
Well, and in reading the book, I take a slightly more positive view than you do after reading your book. The John Paul II example, the example of some of the people you interviewed, they became the light in the darkness of that time. They continued to broadcast that light and, as you say, remind people of why we're here, who we are, what our place in this world and in this nation is. That, I think, we have to dedicate ourselves to and not always get mired down in these tit-for-tat arguments that I think become ideological struggles of no significance. It's those cultural lights that shine in the end, and that's what I took from the book. And when it's all over, when all is said and done, that's what remains. So thank you for that reminder. Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents by Rod Dreher, is available now online and at bookstores everywhere. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you, Raymond.
And speaking of cultural light, I want you all to go out and pre-order my new picture book, The Spider Who Saved Christmas. It's coming this October 15th, just in time for the holidays. It revives an all but forgotten legend surrounding the Christmas story. It's full of heart, suspense, and it explains why we decorate our trees with Christmas tinsel. Here's a little preview of The Spider Who Saved Christmas. Randy Gallegos' illustrations are just beautiful. You saw some of them there. And you will love this heartwarming story. Pre-order The Spider Who Saved Christmas now at EWTN's Religious Catalog, Amazon, or you can visit discoverlegends.com for a preview and more info. The World Over is now available as a podcast. You can download us at iTunes, Apple Music, and Spotify. That's all the time we have for now. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.